Hello and welcome to another episode of the Try Mechanics podcast. This podcast is all about fat adaptation and whether it's something we should be trying to pursue or whether it's been essentially misused or the best way essentially we can go at using it. So I've talked about this subject quite significantly before in my own podcast and also in the Simon Ward podcast, the SWOT podcast. We actually delved into this quite significantly, working on through the different elements. So it's worth going back to listen to those to see whether putting this together with those essentially completes the picture for you. Now, the key thing about fat adaptation is it's become more and more popular over the last few years. Really to try and essentially see whether it can improve your ability to particularly compete well in long distance races, so kind of Ironman and those kind of races. The key thing being is that a lot of the focus has been on trying to adapt to fat, when actually the whole focus really should be whether we are just a little bit over-dependent on carbohydrates. So I've discussed this, to say, at length before, but I'm going to try and summarise all the points and see where I think people are often going wrong with regards to this. The key thing to kind of first off to mention is that in terms of what we're actually after. Now, there's been a lot of studies that have looked at elite athletes and amount of essentially the carbohydrates and fat that elite athletes use, and they tend to burn more energy. They have more calories available, more calories they can access through the fact that their mitochondria, their powerhouse, their kind of energy burning powers of the cells tend to do better work and produce more energy. So they tend to go through more energy. When they have that access to more energy, it enables them to increase the intensity of their exercise and often hold that intensity for much longer. And that's essentially what we're going for. So what we're not really trying to do, we're not trying to fat adapt, in that we're not really trying to exchange one fuel for another. And I found this out to myself, my own kind of detriment, really, in that when I went down a kind of ketogenic route for a long period of time, about 6 months, over 6 months in the end, I found that I essentially readapted to fat and was basically on the opposite end of the spectrum. So I could burn happily on fat. I used ketones. I was producing a lot of ketones as a result of being extremely low carbohydrate. However, I couldn't really burn carbohydrates very well. And when it came to racing, I was finding I was hitting a block at about 4 or 5 hours, simply because the ingested carbohydrates I was trying to take in, I couldn't really essentially use properly because I'd forced my body down the route of fat adaptation. Now, that word force is quite important. There's a lot of evidence now showing that the idea of fat adaptation that comes from, or the way that we adapt from essentially burning more fat from over-consuming fat or changing the fat in our diet, particularly when we're going down the ketogenic route and where 60 up to 60 plus 70% maybe of the diet is comprised of fat, which is quite extreme, is actually we force those changes. So what we do is we essentially pump the cell almost with fat. The intramuscular triglyceride in the muscles, so the fat inside the muscles, actually then starts inhibiting the ability of you to burn carbohydrates. So it forces you to have to burn lots of fat because you're taking lots of fat in and because it's pumped everywhere. Now, is this necessarily a good thing? Possibly not. Possibly it's gone over the line, it's stepped over that line. Now, this is the problem with a lot of these things, is people tend to like to go to extremes. They find that if a small amount of something has a bit of a benefit, they then go to the extreme of thinking that a large amount of it will also have a greater benefit. And that's, I think, to a lot of people's costs with regards to this, because then you lose the ability to contract the muscles at kind of high intensity when they rely on carbohydrate source. But also then your inability to essentially feed as you're going along if you're unable to really use those carbohydrates that you can take in during the race, because you're not going to be able to take in a lot of fat during the race, even if you take it in the form of something like MCT, which tends to be essentially more relatively absorbed. Most people can't tolerate anywhere near enough of MCT, so only maybe a tablespoon over an hour or two to be able to actually supply what we would need to supply if we were relying on that as a fuel source. So that's the key thing. Now, the other thing is that we're getting a bit confused between fat adaptation and fat oxidation. The key thing is what we actually show when we show in those metrics, and this is what people then get confused at, when we show in those studies that those elite athletes, the better performing athletes, have a higher fat oxidation rate. That is a different thing. from being fat adapted, that shows that they are able to burn fat and carbohydrates. So they are burning both at the same time at a higher intensity. And that is the critical thing. The way we do that is simply by getting aerobically fitter. That is the simple way we do it. And the key thing is that is related to areas like the mitochondria and their ability to continue to burn fat and essentially carbohydrates, particularly when a lot of that is coming in, or when then the cell energy is getting low, the ability to continue working hard to convert that into energy so that we can continue to contract the muscles, so we can continue to move forward, so we don't start sending a lot of signals that tell the brain we need to slow down, which is all related to the kind of central governor model and various other models that look at the different elements of fatigue. And that is the critical thing, is that we are pursuing this fat adaptation, whereas actually what we should be pursuing is ability to burn more energy at higher intensities, which you get from being fitter. The other thing is where the things like amino acids become quite important. It's something that I've always used in longer races or longer training, more than about 2 hours, is branched chain amino acids, because they are also important in essentially supplying certain metabolites and that enable us to then burn that energy. The other thing is that if we are low, we have a diet that's kind of low in B vitamins, if we don't have a good gut microbiome or these bits and pieces, we don't have good amounts of magnesium and zinc and good food going in, we actually inhibit our ability to burn the energy we take in. This is why a lot of people have implicated high sugar or high refined food diets in long-term chronic issues, particularly with the mitochondria and the health. Because of this ability, the fact that we're taking lots of refined foods, mean we're not taking in the B vitamins, the other vitamins, all the other bits, the magnesium, zinc, and all the other kind of nutrients that we need to be able to actually burn that energy. So focusing most of our diet on whole foods is really, really important, whether that's whole grains, whole animals. We talked about that before, about the fact that it's important to take in glycine and all these different amino acids, as well as the kind of chicken breast or the breast meat or the essentially the muscle meat. Okay, so what we should be pursuing is increasing fat oxidation. Now, there are lots of different ways to approach that. The main way is to increase our aerobic capacity. So that's working at an aerobic capacity, and that can take many different forms, and I won't go into that here. The idea is that that's basically trying to increase our body's ability to burn energy with oxygen. And that it takes the form of lower intensity training, middle intensity training, higher intensity training, basically training. The different mix of those depends on the person, but also depends on what factors they then need to increase that aerobic capacity. And that's where you start looking at the nuances of the person themselves, whether they actually, what kind of transporters they might have in their muscles that indicate whether they need to be doing more low intensity training to try and upregulate those transporters, or possibly more high intensity training, or somewhere in the middle. If they're time pressed, then the most economical use of time often is that kind of middle zone, as long as it's approached in the right way and we recover well from it, all those different factors. Okay, so that's why I want to give a quick overview of this idea. So don't get stuck in this rabbit hole of fat adaptation. Don't believe that having in lots of fat coming in is necessarily a good thing if it's forcing those changes. And an athlete, you can not only get away with a lot more carbohydrates, but you probably should use more in a targeted way around training sessions. Don't overdo it massively on the saturated fat, olive oil, coconut oil, and those things. Use them in good sparing doses, but try and think of them more as whole foods. So something that I've done recently is I've gone from using a lot of refined fats, be it olive oil, which is a refined fat, butter, again, refined fats, to actually trying to use what complements with the food. So trying to use the fat that comes with a chicken, for instance, and cook it in its own fat. Pork and those things the same, and using small amounts of butter to kind of make dishes sing, but really not trying to overdo it, not trying to use those refined source of fat as a pure kind of energy source, more just helping the cooking and essentially the process to make the food taste really good, but not overdoing it. And then using carbohydrates in the way that we're meant to, is that they're mostly whole, mostly essentially cooked in a nice way, essentially, so that they don't become bags of sugar like a kind of roast potato. and using them, as I say, using them in moderation, using them around training session, using them as much as you kind of feel like you need to. If you're doing more training, then using more carbohydrates, because if you do more training, if you use those carbohydrates, you can do more training, and therefore you can become more aerobically strong, therefore you will burn more fat. And that is the kind of logical argument that's often missed, is that if you're forcing yourself to always be training fasted all the time, if you're training yourself to basically to only fuel on fat, and the problem is that if you are taking in fat, let's say you have a couple of eggs and a bit of bacon before you go out for a long ride and you don't take in anything, you are fueling that on your own stores, because you're not going to be absorbing that fat that quickly, and you're not going to be using it that quickly because it'll go to the liver, then the fat tissue, then back out again. So you are again forcing your body to try and use what is a less efficient fuel source. Unfortunately, fat is less efficient when it comes to actually muscle contraction. We always will try and use that glucose as our preferred source. So actually, it's probably better if we are able to do the high quality training that we want to be able to do on that, then so be it, that's fine. But if it inhibits the ability to develop good aerobic conditioning because we are trying to stifle our ability to use those carbohydrates, then it's counterproductive. And this is when you go down the route of fat adaptation, and you go from one extreme of being carb and sugar dependent to in the other extreme of not being able to burn them and having to burn fats and ketones. And I found that when I was ketogenic, I producing lots of ketones, I felt fantastic. But on the odd day here and there when I'd had a little bit too much protein, sometimes can knock you out of that ketogenic state, I felt pretty dreadful. And that was the problem. It was as hit and miss as going down the carb-fueled route. However, it wasn't as easy rectifiable. So when you're going down the carb-fueled route, you can rectify it sometimes by taking in a bit of carbohydrates. So the kind of end notes of this is, if you want to improve your ability, you improve your fat oxidation, your primary goal is to increase your ability to do training, aerobic training that works on that function. Use carbohydrates sparingly around workouts to try and target them for what you need. So try not to overdo the carbohydrates before workouts if you don't really need them, unless you're doing something that is higher intensity. Therefore, the best way of approaching that is maybe 2 or 3 hours before, making sure your glycogen stores are more topped off for the majority of your sessions. However, you can also add in some fasted training, but it's small amounts, once or maybe twice a week, or going through the kind of sleep low type cycle where you just take away a bit of carbohydrate just when your body thinks it might need it, and then you do a little bit of fasted training. It goes a very, very long way. Small amounts of fasted training go a long way, and the problem is that do too much of it, so do consecutive days, 2 or 3 or 4 days a week, or every training session, and you miss breakfast every morning, and 2 things might happen. One, it can affect your hormones in the long term if you're doing lots of fasted training, because at the end of the day, the studies that looked at this side of things is that when energy status is perceived as low, we then start down-regulating things like testosterone, our sex hormones, because we don't need them. They are not as vital as maintaining our energy status that keeps us moving forward. That can have a significant long-term consequence. So we don't want to be doing that. Even if we are backloading, it often could, essentially having things later on in the day, that itself can upset our circadian rhythm. Different people are different susceptibilities to this, and actually it turns out it's all related to our genes and various other factors. But some people do much better having breakfast and they sleep much better in the evening. Some people are the other way around, but actually the research suggests the majority of people are better off having breakfast, having earlier on food in the day or in the daylight, in improving their sleep. But by doing that, it actually improves their things like their hormones, their serotonin, their melatonin, the happiness, dopamine, testosterone, all the great things going on, but it helps balance everything. And we get in this kind of rush of cortisol and get completely unbalanced when things go all over the place. And training is hard and stressful. If you want to get the most out of your training, your health comes first. Then you get the most out of your training. Then you get more health from that. So it's a cycle. If you compromise your health for your training, eventually that cycle will end. And you'll end up in a very bad downward spiral from that. So that's what I want you to talk about today, is that don't buy into this idea that to be fat adapted, you need to be fasting all the time, fasting training, trying to push out that training as much as you possibly can. Just try to become a little less dependent on carbohydrates. You don't, take away often the sugar. That's the key thing, is that there's a difference really between sugar and carbohydrates from perspective of that sweetness side of things is quite important. That sweetness tells the brain that it's going to get a constant supply. And sweetness is something that was very rare for our brain to have to handle, because the sweetest things we had were maybe a bit of fruit that wasn't very sweet, possibly honey. But honey was extremely addictive. And when they often found honey, they didn't save and store it. They ate a whole lot in one go because it was so addictive and so amazingly sweet. So bear that in mind. Our brains aren't really meant to do it. And what it does, it often then makes us constantly rely on it, which means that when we do an hour or so and we're feeling a little low, our brain almost says, give me some sugar. Now, if there's no sugar available, it starts telling us we feel pretty rubbish. And that has a really bad consequence for obviously our ability to then continue to the exercise, which is why things like mouth rinses can work, because they almost pep up the brain. But the problem is that they only have a short-term effect, because soon your brain learns that it's only getting a rinse of carbohydrate in its mouth and it's not actually getting anything particularly good. And that's the key thing, is that removing that reliance on sugar, taking away a lot of that kind of little bit of a sweet tooth and saving that sweet tooth for after, let's say, a hard training session or something where you've really earned it. It's really good for removing that carb, essentially, dependence. That means that we're a bit more balanced. So I hope that's helped a little bit on the fat adaptation front. If you've got any specific questions about this, please ask. It's a big topic. I'm going to try and cover it in lots of different bits and pieces, but hopefully that gives you an idea of where fat adaptation and increasing fat oxidation actually differ. Thank you very much, and goodbye.